Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm going to give a quick introduction here, and then I will pass it off to our speaker. So real briefly, let me say hello. My name is Joe Kelly. I am the Community Relations Program host at the Rochester Hills Public Library, and I would like to welcome you to this evening's presentation, Human Trafficking 101 with Dawn Ames. We would like to thank the Friends of the Rochester Hills Public Library for supporting our programs through their many fundraising efforts. We greatly appreciate their support. You can register for our upcoming programs by visiting calendar.rhpl.org. Next Tuesday at 7 p.m. here on Zoom, we'll be hosting Dr. Sruti March and a discussion on fighting cancer, heart disease, and diabetes with your fork. Visit calendar.rhpl.org again to register for that. This evening, all attendees will remain muted throughout the program. We encourage you to ask questions in the chat feature below. I'll leave a message to let you know where that is. We will be doing a Q&A later on after the presentation, but if you want to send in your questions as it goes along, I'll take note of them and we'll ask whatever ones have not been answered throughout the presentation as we go along. And the program is currently being recorded. I might have a mixed message here. I'm not 100% sure if this one is going up on YouTube or not. Is this one being recorded?
If you're asking me, I'm not sure.
Well, I know it's being recorded. Did you get permission for this one to go up?
I believe so, okay. Yes.
Sorry, I might have a copy text because we had one recently where we they didn't want it to go up. So as far as I understand, this should be going up onto our YouTube platform in about a week. Apologies for any misunderstandings if something funny happens with that. I believe it will be up in about a week. But that aside, tonight we welcome Dawn Ames, the Director of Family Ministry at Lake Orion United Methodist Church and a community group leader for the Lake Orion Oxford chapter of the Michigan Abolitionist Project, MAP. This evening, she will explain the definition of human trafficking, where it occurs, and who are the victims. She will also address the most common myths associated with human trafficking, as well as signs to look for in your life. So please welcome Dawn Ames.
Thank you so much for the invitation to speak, and thank you for joining me and having me do this presentation. This is a very dark topic to address, and I commend all of you for wanting to learn more about it. I also want to mention this is the first time I've ever done a Zoom presentation, so I apologize if any technical issues happen as a result of me causing something to happen. So I'm just going to go ahead and start my presentation. Give me a second.
Looks great.
Started here.
Awesome.
Is not sharing at this point.
I see the slideshow on my end.
Are you seeing it?
Yes.
Okay.
So if you want to just hit from slideshow start, if anybody isn't seeing it, you can leave a message in the chat. At least on my end, I can see it.
Okay. All right. Because it's not letting me go to the front of my presentation here.
I think you can click the slideshow.
I got it now.
There we go.
Thank you. So hopefully that's the only technical issue I will have.
Hopefully.
So anyway, I am Dawn Ames, as Joe had introduced me. I'm part of the Michigan Abolitionist Project, or also referred to as MAP. We are an organization that includes a community group network. We do collaboration efforts with other anti-trafficking organizations, and we also do awareness events throughout the state of Michigan. You're probably asking the question of, what is a community group? And so a community group there's actually 10 community groups in the Michigan Abolitionist Project, and they are throughout the state of Michigan. Our particular one focuses on the Lake Orion and Oxford area, but honestly, we do presentations throughout the North Oakland area. And our purpose of our community group is that we are actually everyday people using our gifts and talents to prevent and end modern-day slavery in our communities. I'm actually one of 3 people that are community group leaders in our organization. Linda and Pamela are also part of Lake Orion and Oxford Community Group. So people often ask me, how did I get involved in the anti-human trafficking movement? And because I don't think you just roll over and from bed one day and just say, hey, this is what I'm going to do. And it was kind of a progression. Back in about 2013, the church that I work for decided to do a fundraiser for a local organization that rescued and rehabilitated girls in the Brazil, a town in Brazil. And actually that was my comfort level for my introduction to trafficking, because that's something that happened somewhere far away. And that's kind of how I thought about it at that particular time. And I think that was pretty common back at that particular time, is that we thought about trafficking happening somewhere else. Over the course of about 3 years, we did these trafficking fundraisers for this particular organization. And I actually, at that particular time, I'm looking into learning more about the topic. And I ran across 2 different books, one of which was called In Our Backyard, and the other one was it was called The Slave Next Door. And In Our Backyard actually addresses human trafficking in the United States, and specifically in the Michigan area. And The Slave Next Door is a victim account of human trafficking that actually happened in the 1980s. So that really opened my eyes as to, this is actually happening around me. And I found that I really wanted to spend more time addressing the topic here, not only in the state of Michigan, but in the United States. So this presentation that you're going to hear tonight is called Human Trafficking 101 in the Basics. So I'm hoping by the end of this presentation, you'll know the myths, you know the facts, and you'll know who is at risk of being trafficked. So whatever brought you here, many people attend one of these presentations out of fear because they hear about trafficking, they've seen what's in the news, and they want to learn more about it because they're afraid of it. And I not discourage you from being afraid of trafficking. However, what I would hope to do is that after you listen to my presentation, that some of that fear has been minimized, and that will cause you to actually have some type of action, and that you want to get involved in some way. And actually, this is one of my favorite statements, is that we are all part of the problem, but we can all be part of the solution. So whatever types of trafficking that we are talking about, we actually all have a part in creating it, but we can also all be part of eradicating it. So just to give you an idea, that there's 3 main types of trafficking: sex trafficking, labor trafficking, and organ trafficking. Tonight, I will spend the majority of my time talking about sex trafficking. I will touch a little bit on labor trafficking, and actually that's a whole other, it deserves its own presentation, and I'm hoping to be invited back at some point in time to be able to talk about that. And then this is the only time I'll refer to organ trafficking, but it's actually what it is. It's organs being harvested out of humans and being sold on the black market. So this is not a technical issue here. I'm going to show you a video. It's called Stop This Traffic. It's put on by an organization out of the Grand Rapids area. And I really want you to really pay attention to the stories that are being told in this particular video, because usually if I'm doing this presentation in a live manner, I usually quiz you, but I'm not going to be able to do that at this particular time. So here's the short video. Interstate of sea.
Hey Dawn, the sound on our end isn't really coming through, and the video's being.
Oh, it isn't coming through?
Yeah.
Huh. See if this will, is that better?
No, I'm not hearing any audio.
Not happening? Okay. Okay. You know what? I'm going to skip that, but I'm going to tell you how to get to it. So after this, I'm going to encourage you to watch it.
Okay.
Yeah. So the video is actually, as I said, put on by an organization out of Grand Rapids. Again, if you have a piece of paper and a pencil handy, it's called Stop This Traffic. And it's actually about a 5-minute video that talks about trafficking in the Grand Rapids area. It's a very emotional video. It basically talks about some young people that were recruited into being trafficked. And it really shows the scope of what trafficking looks like on the west side of the state. It's a very emotional video, but what I hope, if you share that after this particular presentation, you can share what you've learned with your circle of influence. And it's a really emotional video, and it really tells you a good story about how trafficking happens, as well as the scope of what is happening in the state of Michigan. So this is one of my slides that talk about labor trafficking, but I wanted to touch on it somewhat because actually we have more cases of labor trafficking that are prosecuted in the state of Michigan than we do sex trafficking. So it is a large issue in our state. So I wanted to make sure that people were aware of it happening. So what does labor trafficking look like in the United States, including in the state of Michigan? So these are areas in which you can find potential victims of labor trafficking. So one is agriculture, and I'm sure that's not a shock to anyone. But in the state of Michigan, we have over 70 crops that are harvested. And that's an area that we do have trafficking occurring in our state. Construction and general maintenance work, domestic servitude, which includes like maids and nannies, ethnic restaurant work. And I try to refer to a story that was from a couple years ago that happened in, I believe it was the city of Novi, in which about 8 people perished in the basement of a home. And there was a lock on the door. People couldn't exit the basement. And that was a suspected case of labor trafficking in our area. Circus and county fair work, hospitality industry, gas stations and convenience stores, clothing stores, especially and particularly in resort areas, small factory work, landscape workers, magazine salespeople, particularly teens being dropped off in an area. And that just blew me away when I heard that. And then nail and hair salons are also areas that you might find labor trafficking victims.
Dawn, if I can interrupt just for a moment.
Sure.
I did look at the chat. A couple of people mentioned that there might be a solution for the audio.
Oh.
And, I looked it up, and I think maybe it might be an issue when you share your screen. I think there will be a box, a little box that says share audio. So if you want to go back and try that again, you might have to reinitiate screen sharing.
Okay, so, I have to go out? Okay.
Yeah, like reinitiate it. And when you initiate it, there should be a checkbox that says share computer sound.
So share, where's that at?
Yeah, just like you shared your screen earlier, there should be a checkbox. What I'm seeing, it shows up to the bottom, like left, under your options for what you want to share.
Bottom left. Not the stop video. Mute.
Have you like when you hit the share screen button and it gives you the options of what like program you want to share from, like your desktop, your. Oh, that's it. Yeah, it's let me try on my end. Yeah.
Yeah. See if you can.
Yeah, because I can.
That particular one.
So
share.
It's when you hit the share screen button.
Okay.
And you'll have your pop-up window, like right when you hit that green share screen button, you'll have a big pop-up window.
Aha.
Yeah,
okay, I got
the bottom left there, share computer sound, click that, then share your screen. You should be good.
Awesome. That's better. I learn something new every day.
We're all just figuring it out together. Thank you again.
Thank
I'm
you.
going to go ahead and give a shout out to Bridget in the chat. Thank you very much for pointing that out. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to go watch the video because this is really an awesome video. So I'm going to try.
I'm Mary, by the way.
Hi, Mary. Tonight.
Tonight, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Don't mind the giant microphone above your head.
I'll try not to.
There are 3 photos in front of you. If you could just pick one, it doesn't really matter which one it is, and show that one to us.
All right.
Could you describe her to us?
She looks youthful. I feel like this is one of those situations where if I say he's 23, then he's actually going to be 16.
Hispanic, maybe not full, but part. Similar to me, actually.
Well, I mean, she's young, so probably has a lot of things to look forward to.
I would describe him as friendly.
She looks, I don't know, happy. She doesn't look shy, but confident.
Anything she puts her mind to, she could achieve.
We actually have his story, if you could read that out loud to us.
Okay, Marcus. I grew up really close to my parents. Adriana. I grew up with my brother and sister.
Amy. I remember watching the Olympics on TV when I was 5 and being totally in awe of the sprinters.
I was the middle child and easily the quietest.
I felt like no one ever saw me or cared.
Dad was too drunk to keep a job, and he never even saw me unless I was in his way.
Okay, do we know what happened there?
No, I don't. It looks like the screen just kind of gave up.
Ah,
Oh, geez. This seems like it might be it seems like the video is having trouble sharing because it was kind of choppy. It was enough that I could kind of gather what was going on.
okay, you know what? It's actually not from the internet, so it's an
Yeah,
MP4.
it's embedded on the
so-
PowerPoint.
Yeah, so I'm thinking that we probably should skip this for right now.
Okay.
And then,
if you want to provide a link, I can definitely drop that in the chat. We can even do that later when we open things up to questions.
that would be great. And actually, like I said, if they just type in "stop this traffic" into YouTube, it pops right up. And it's
Okay.
very, very easy to find. So I apologize for that. I've not usually had that particular problem.
Maybe around the Q&A section, I can try and bring it up on mine too and see if I can screen share it and it works better there. We can give that a shot.
That's perfect. Okay, so going back to the screen that we're talking about what commercial sex exploitation looks like in the United States. So many people are very familiar with what street exploitation is. That's what you usually see in most movies, and it's what happens on street corners per se. But many people think that that's the only way it happens, and commercial sex exploitation is actually a number of things. It also includes child pornography, strip clubs, erotic nude massage, escort services, phone sex lines, private parties, interfamiliar pimping, which is what it is. It's family members pimping out other family members, and forms of internet-based exploitation and pornography. And so it's not just the street exploitation, it's all of those things is what is considered or could be potential for human trafficking. So where does human trafficking occur? It occurs everywhere. So it's not something that just occurs in other countries. It's probably happening within miles of where we're all sitting. So there's really not a place that it is not happening. So according to a report released by the U.S. Secretary of State in last year in 2019, the U.S. ranked as one of the worst countries in the world for human trafficking, and that's including sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And the top 3 nations for origins for victims of human trafficking in 2018 were the United States, Mexico, and the Philippines. So the nation of origin. So hopefully that dispels the belief that the victims are all being trafficked into this country. We have enough of our own domestic victims to fill the need, I guess, without having to go outside to other countries. And the United States is actually #1 in the purchasing of consumer sex worldwide. And it just so happens that we are one of the wealthiest countries. And so not necessarily that we want to be #1 in this particular area. So I wanted to talk about the word traffic because many people feel that the word traffic means that a victim actually goes from point A to point B and that there has to be some type of transportation of the victim. And actually the trafficking term used in human trafficking has to do with a trade or a deal or a bargain. So there doesn't have to be any type of movement of the victim in order for it to count as human trafficking. So the categories of human trafficking victims in the US, this is how we classify them and how we can tell if they are a victim or not. So children under the age of 18 that are induced in commercial sex, those are automatically considered victims. There is no such thing as a child prostitute. And many times you'll see that in the media that they'll be referred to as a child prostitute. There's no such thing, and they're automatically considered to be a trafficking victim. Now, adults, if they're age 18 and over and they are in the commercial sex industry, in order for it to be considered trafficking, it has to be under force, fraud, or coercion in order to classify under that category. And then for children and adults induced to perform labor and services, they have to be under force, fraud, or coercion. So children and adults are under the same classification in order to be considered a human trafficking victim as far as labor goes. I actually did this presentation to a group of students at Oxford High School, and I made the joke because I could see their eyes, and it was just funny. And I said, you know, if your parents ask you to clean your room or clean the house and take away your phone, that is not what we call labor trafficking. So just was a little joke because they were like, oh, well, does this apply to me? It doesn't. So the three words that I want you to remember is force, fraud, or coercion. So many people feel that when they hear the word slavery, because that is often slavery and human trafficking are used interchangeably. And, you know, the belief has typically been that slavery was abolished about 150 years ago with the Civil War. But actually, there are more slaves today in the world than there has ever been at any point in history. And to kind of give you a perspective of what the value of a slave was in the past and what it is currently. In 1809, when you adjust the price to today's market, a slave actually cost a slave owner about $40,000 to purchase that particular slave. Currently, and it says 2009, but the amount hasn't changed, the actual number is about $90. And so what does that mean for victims? You know, back 200 plus years ago, with a price tag on them of $40,000, slaves were valuable and they were expensive property. Now with a $90 investment in order to get a victim of human trafficking, they're more considered as disposable. So I always try to refer it to as that globally the average investment, I think is a better word instead of cost, because people consider that cost, meaning that's how much you purchase a perpetrator or a Don would purchase a victim. What we're talking about is a pimp or somebody that's purchasing somebody for labor trafficking. The average investment for them is about $90. And for trafficking, the product is reusable. And so it can be used over and over again, so it's very profitable. And try to give you an idea of how profitable human trafficking is. It's the second largest and fastest growing criminal enterprise in the world. And to give you an idea of scope, human trafficking makes more money than Google, Starbucks, Nike, and the NFL combined. So it is a very profitable industry. Also, to give you an idea of scope, is that human trafficking victims actually represent a very small portion of victims of human trafficking. And this is an estimate. When we start getting into percentages and numbers, we have to be careful when we do that. However, it's 12% or a very small number of human trafficking victims are actually sex trafficking victims. But sex trafficking victims or sex trafficking is much more profitable than labor trafficking. So 66% of the global profits are from sex trafficking. So why does modern day slavery still exist? And it's just a simple formula of supply and demand. And so as long as there's going to be a demand for cheap labor or for sex, there's going to be somebody that fills that demand. So you ask the question is, why is there an increase in trafficking? Why is there more slaves now than there were in the past? And a lot of it has to do with technology and the ability to transport and the ease of transporting victims. So if you look at the technology that's available today, we have phones, we have the internet, we have the means of being able to communicate from one country to another and to be able to order whatever type of victim that we want or the type of person that we want. The other thing is that before you had to travel by ship. It took a long time. It was very costly. Now we can fly people from point A to point B if we want to, and the ease of transportation is cheaper and takes less time. So this is an important question: is how do traffickers pick their victims? And it's actually by manipulating vulnerabilities. And so this is what we refer to as that there's often a promise or something that's offered somehow to the victim. And whether that means a loving relationship, it could be drugs, it could be education, some material item, or a job or money. It's something that is lacking in the victim's life that the trafficker can entice them into this type of life. And I like visuals because I teach kids. I'm a youth director, so I like to use visuals and try to hit home an idea. But it's like a carrot. So that promise is like a carrot in front of that victim. And so any of those things can entice somebody into this type of life. So again, it's manipulating the vulnerabilities under force, fraud, and coercion, and that equals human trafficking. So you asked the question about what are the vulnerabilities that lead to this type of victimization. And so these are types of ways that a trafficker can use, or the types of people that they're going after. And so one of them is runaway and homeless youth, youth that are in poverty, because again, you're looking for something that they might need, whether it's food, shelter, clothing, whatever. Poverty is a huge area that they will draw victims from. Drug addiction, either theirs or their parents. So you figure if somebody is already addicted to drugs, they will more likely have the behavior of being drawn into that type of life in order to obtain additional drugs. And also for their parents' drug addiction, oftentimes the children are sold in order to get money for more drugs. Children and youth in foster care, this is a huge area. It's estimated that over 70% of your human trafficking victims that are children come out of the foster care system. Foreign nationals, it's a myth that most of the labor trafficking and the human trafficking victims are here illegally. Actually, it's a huge enterprise of folks overseas that are getting visas and passports for folks, bringing them here on those visas and then taking their paperwork once they get here, and that's a means of power and control. Undocumented citizens, abuse victims, whether they were sexually abused or physically abused, lonely and unsupervised youth, looking for connection, people with disabilities, and the LGBTQ community. And I have a door there because, again, I like visuals. It's these types of things open a door for a trafficker to let them in to that person's life. And so I know we didn't watch this video, but this video actually talks about various victims and how their trafficker actually lured them into that life. And so when you watch that video, I want you to be aware of the fact that many of the victims talk about physical abuse, their parent working 2 or 3 jobs so that they're not home, the fact that they needed a place to stay, that they were couch surfing. And so that trafficker used that as a means of luring them into that type of life.
If you'd like, I could try and give it a shot of loading that up right now.
You want to try that?
Yeah, let me give it a shot.
Okay. So you want me to just stay on this?
Exit your screen share and I'll get that loaded up.
Okay, so get out of that?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, cool.
I'll load that up right away and go to.
You might have a better chance of getting in.
I'm gonna try and just load it right off of YouTube. If I see the video.
Some companies still have
letting an ad play through.
That's why I like to have it ready, because I don't have to listen to all that.
All right. So let's zoom. That. With computers
You just take a seat.
All right.
Thank you so much for coming in. I'm Mary, by the way.
I'm Mary. Tonight.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Don't mind the giant microphone above your head.
I'll try not to.
There are 3 photos in front of you. If you could just pick one, it doesn't really matter which one it is, and show that one to us.
All right.
Could you describe her to us?
She looks youthful. I feel like this is one of those situations where if I say he's 23, then he's actually going to be 16.
Hispanic, maybe not full, but part. Similar to me, actually.
Well, I mean, she's young, so probably has a lot of things to look forward to.
I would describe him as friendly.
She looks, I don't know, happy. She doesn't look shy, but confident.
Anything she puts her mind to, she could achieve.
We actually have his story, if you could read that out loud to us.
Okay, Marcus. I grew up really close to my parents. Adriana. I grew up with my brother and sister.
Amy. I remember watching the Olympics on TV when I was 5 and being totally in awe of the sprinters.
I was the middle child and easily the quietest.
I felt like no one ever saw me or cared.
Dad was too drunk to keep a job, and he never even saw me unless I was in his way.
Mom worked 2 jobs to make sure we had food for every meal, so she was never here to know when he would hit us.
One day when I went to the mall, like I like to do to be out of the house, a man came up to me and told me I was beautiful and asked me on a date.
On our first date, he drove me around in his car and said we could eat whatever I wanted.
Every time we were together, he bought me something new.
Tom really cared about me, and Tom really made me feel special.
I was in love with him.
After only going out for 3 weeks, Tom offered me a way out of my home, asked me to move in with him.
So when he asked me to have sex with him, I did.
He would put his hand over my face until I couldn't breathe.
Tom had friends over pretty regularly, and I could tell that some of his friends were into me.
So I kept my door locked and hoped that no one would bother me.
After a few nights of crashing there, he said that I still owed him for letting me stay at his place.
He said he had a friend who wanted to spend an hour with me.
He told me I might have to do some stuff, but not to worry about it. It's not a big deal.
When I didn't want to, he slapped me and said no one ever cared about me like he did.
But I didn't know what else to do because I needed a place to stay.
His friends forced themselves on me and took turns while he watched.
One by one, they come down to the basement, telling me how pretty I am.
When they're on top of me, I just close my eyes and pretend I'm running.
I'm exhausted and I don't know what to do.
My name is Adriana. I'm 16 years old.
My name is Marcus. I'm 14 years old.
My name is Amy. I'm 12 years old.
I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
And I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
And I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
That was very different than what I thought.
Especially because, like, being a girl and imagining, like, if that was me, like, that's I don't even know. I can't even imagine what that would be like.
She deserves to be a kid, just like what she is in this picture.
It being so close to home is something that makes me want to jump out of this chair.
I wouldn't think that Grand Rapids is a place where anything like this would ever happen.
Because you don't want it to happen to anybody, and you really don't want it to happen to people that live where you live.
Thank you for sharing her story with us. I'd like to show you something if you wouldn't mind taking her picture and following me to the gym.
Oh, wow.
I expected something certainly a lot smaller.
Bar graphs and numbers but these are actual people.
I don't know. In like my world, in my bubble or whatever, we don't talk about this. It's not something you think about.
You know, what we see is only on the surface.
I mean, looking at this, sex trafficking doesn't have any discrimination, that's for sure. Ages, genders, can affect anybody.
It hits you right in your heart, your gut, your stomach. It's like, wow. Now it's like I feel like I have this weight of responsibility to see how I can help.
Changes through greater awareness and making people realize that this does happen here and will continue to happen until we decide to make a stop.
Hi, I'm
All right. So every time I watch that video, it's very disturbing. And I'm hoping you had a visceral reaction to that like I did. And I think I've watched that video probably 60 plus times and continue to have that same reaction. So going back to the presentation, I did want to make sure that you share that video with your circle of influence, because I think it's really important. As I talked about how the vulnerabilities that lead to trafficking, that video does a really good job talking about those particular vulnerabilities. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the Jeffrey Epstein documentary on Netflix. If you haven't had the opportunity to watch it, I would highly recommend it. It's very disturbing. However, what you will notice in that particular documentary is this playing out. So he did exactly, enticed his victims in the very traditional way, if you want to say that. He went into mobile home parks, found girls that needed money, wanted items, material items, and it was very attractive for those girls to be part of Jeffrey Epstein's world. And so you see this concept being played out within that documentary. So I think it's definitely worth a watch if you can handle the topic. So moving on to talking a little bit about runaways. Back in 2018, similar numbers the past couple years. there was almost 24,000 endangered runaways that were reported to the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children. It's estimated that about one in 7 of those runaways will be likely to be victims of child sex trafficking. And it's also interesting to note that these same endangered runaways, about 88% of them were in the care of social services or foster care when they ran. And so when we start talking about areas in which you can get involved, foster care and homelessness and runaways is one big area that needs a lot of help and preventing it from happening. The other interesting thing worth noting is that unfortunately, many times law enforcement spends more time recovering vehicles than they do recovering runaways. And that's something that needs to change in order for us to do the right thing for these children. So why do traffickers target runaways or runaway or homeless youth? Because it's easier to take a kid from the street when no one knows they're gone. And so when we're talking about what types of victims a trafficker is looking for, they want to entice victims that no one is going to look for. And so I give the example of, I'm a mom of 5 children, and we can argue whether if a trafficker took one of my kids, whether they would probably bring them back right away, depending on the child that they take. But the idea behind it is that they wouldn't want to take one of my children. And why? Because I would have it I would notify every law enforcement, the media, social media, and it would be a big headache for a trafficker. So they're not looking to steal a child that somebody wants to look for. And so I think that's addressing one of the myths that we'll talk about in a little bit. But they really do want to find a child that that doesn't really have a loved one or a parent that's going to look for them. We also, it's important to note that the predators are now using technology to prey on vulnerable persons. And so younger and younger children are having access to the internet, phones, etc. And so when you're looking at these vulnerabilities, this is kind of how predators are getting their victims currently. So many times people ask, why don't the victims leave and escape their traffickers? Especially since if they were to see a victim going to a store or being able to leave the home that they're living in, why don't they just walk away and get help? So there's a variety of reasons why this typically is not happening. One of the main ones for many of these victims is they have feelings for their trafficker. That trafficker is fulfilling some type of a need for love and affection, and they oftentimes don't feel that they are a victim because that relationship is better than no relationship. Oftentimes there's some type of physical abuse that is happening or threat of physical abuse, and it could be their own or somebody else that's around in that same what is referred to sometimes as a stable of other girls or other victims. So seeing somebody else's abuse is just as effective as having it happen to them. Oftentimes traffickers will use drugs in order to get compliant victims, and so they need additional drugs, so they stay in this particular life in order to maintain their drug habit. Oftentimes a young woman will have a child at some point during the time that they're being trafficked, and that is used as a means of power control. Also threatening the family members or people close to the victim. And this could happen in the United States, in the same neighborhood, or it could actually even be overseas and threatening to take their family's land away, or threatening to hurt a family even across the ocean. And why I bring this up is that many times when we talk about trafficking, we will see victims with, or the ads that will show chains on the victim's hands. And that is very rare that a victim is actually chained up at all. Those chains actually occur in the person's mind, and that's how the victim is controlled and then why they don't leave. So kind of looking for, at prosecutions and convictions, according to the State Department, in 2017, there was a little, almost 18,000 prosecutions of human trafficking worldwide, resulting in a little over 7,000 convictions. So that just doesn't seem like a lot of convictions to the prosecutions. And so you ask the question, why are there so few convictions in trafficking cases? One of the main reasons is that victims oftentimes do not make good witnesses. Especially in the United States, we have guidelines as far as innocent until proven guilty, and we require our witnesses to be good witnesses. So, for example, many of your victims are have a lot of fear of their trafficker, and to have to face their trafficker in a courtroom, it's just too overwhelming for them. Oftentimes, a victim is who has been trafficked, has been traumatized and raped thousands of times. So trauma actually affects how we recall details and how the memory works. And unfortunately, when it comes to a court, when you go to court, you have to be able to recite events in a chronological order, which is not always how victims remember events. Also, victims are often addicted to some type of drug, also not making a good witness. Sometimes they have feelings for their trafficker and they have they had a relationship with them. Don't often see themselves still as victims when these court cases come up. Also, for many of your labor trafficking victims, some money is better than no money. And so these traffickers are very smart. They give the folks money to be able to send home to their families. And even though they don't have any control over their life here, some money here is better than no money at home. So I give you and I'm not sure if you had seen this this case. It was back in 2018-19 of a couple in Macomb County. And they actually had trafficked a young woman that had special needs, offered her a place to stay, and then after about a month, decided that she needs to earn her keep, put her in a shed, and sold her for sex for about a month until her family discovered this was happening. And I look at this case, and I remember seeing it come into the newspapers, and I'm thinking that was an open and shut case. You know, obviously the woman was disabled. They sold her, advertised her online, and they sold her for sex. Should be an open and shut case. But unfortunately, in this particular case, I mean, the good news is that the gentleman got, I shouldn't even call him a gentleman, the man got 20 years in prison. However, the woman that also was part of this this case is the one that advertised the woman on the internet, only got 5 years probation with a day's time served from her 5-year probation sentence. So it's not always an open and shut case, and that's why we don't see the conviction rate as high as the prosecution. So we all want statistics and we all like data. So what are the statistics when it comes to human trafficking? And I'm here to tell you that there's not a lot of data. And so when we look at how we collect data, there is not one system that collects information on trafficking. For example, there is not a census that can tell you how many trafficking victims there are in Michigan, in the United States, or worldwide. It's not like you volunteer that information, and oftentimes actually victims don't know they're victims, right? And the other thing is when we talk about the legal system, there is not a consistent way that we track these types of cases. So it's not you can't just go to a computer, search something, and have that pop up. So there's very little data that's collected on trafficking. We're getting better, but it's not there yet. And oftentimes when we read articles or we read research on or newspaper or things that are shared on the internet, we will see that the National Human Trafficking Hotline, or Polaris, referenced. And I just wanted to tell you what Polaris and the National Human Trafficking Line is, so that it gives you context when you see somebody gives numbers as a result of what they actually do. So Polaris is actually a hotline that people can call in to report suspicious activity, that victims can call in to try to get resources to get out of that particular life. And that it's a referral system. So oftentimes when you see the number of a number from Polaris, you're talking about the number of calls that come in. So it doesn't necessarily mean the number of cases. It is referencing the number of calls that actually come into the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So it kind of gives you context. So it's cases, not cases, but calls. So addressing some of the human trafficking myths that I think we probably have all heard over the past several years. I'm going to start with the Super Bowl, and that is when human trafficking happens. Like there's an event that happens that human trafficking like comes to town, like the circus, and that once that Super Bowl leaves that town, that everything calms down, it goes back to normal. And so I want to put context around when you, the weeks leading up to Super Bowl, if you're in the space of human trafficking, you hear in the area where the Super Bowl is going to occur, there's anti-trafficking organizations that are putting out flyers at local hotels. They are distributing pictures of missing children. There's this huge awareness campaign that's going around the Super Bowl. And I will tell you that probably with the number of people, the influx of people that are coming into that town, the trafficking numbers would rise. What I want you to understand when it comes to this is that once that event leaves, trafficking is still happening in that area. And if they were to law enforcement put effort into rescuing victims, not just on the Super Bowl, but maybe the Tuesday after, you would most likely get the same number of victims. And so it's a blip in time that I wish we would spend the other 364 days doing the same thing. So it's not just a one-time event, it's happening in that area all 365 days. Again, referencing the chains around the arms or around the hands. We talked about, again, the fact that trafficking is more chains in the head than actual physical chains. I'm sure most of you heard that Great Lakes Crossing is a huge area that trafficking occurs. I've heard something of Baldwin Road being the Baldwin corridor, and actually there is no evidence that that is happening at the mall, at that mall. And so I always tell people that, is it safe to people ask, well, is it safe to let my teenager go hang out at the mall? No, it's not safe to have your child hang out at the mall because other shady things are happening there, but probably not trafficking. And so there has been no evidence through law enforcement that that is actually happening. Also addressing the border crossing, again, that a victim doesn't have to move from A to B in order to be considered being trafficked. Again, that woman was trafficked in a shed, never moved from that household, and still was considered a trafficking victim. And then also dispelling the myth that all the victims are coming from another country. And if you remember that the United States was one of the top 3 countries that has countries of origin that has victims. So the victims aren't necessarily coming from out of the country here in the United States, that we have our own domestic problem. Another question was, is all prostitution human trafficking? And the answer is no. I actually would ask you guys, but you're all muted. But there's those 3 words that are very important when we decide whether it's prostitution or human trafficking, and it's force, fraud, or coercion. So if there's one of those three things that are happening in the situation, it's considered human trafficking. But if there's not, then it would just be prostitution. Most people have heard the Michigan is number 2, following Nevada for human trafficking, and we know that's not true because we don't have the data to support that. Where that statistics actually came from is from a couple years ago when there was a multi-state sting that was happening, and Michigan just happened to have the second largest number of victim recoveries, and so that's how we got that number 2 label. Again, looking at the picture at the bottom with street exploitation, while that still happens, a lot of your trafficking is now happening online or through the internet, and it's not on street corners. Also, the average age of a trafficking victim, I'm not sure if you've heard this, but many people refer to it as about 12 years old. Actually, the statistics that we do know, it's probably closer to the age of 16. But I think what's important to note that there's victims as young as 1 month and on up that are considered victims. So I'm really not sure that that is really necessary to know how old. Again, anybody under the age of 18 is a victim of human trafficking. And also dispelling the myth that victims are kidnapped. The statistic back in, it was 2018, I don't know if the numbers for 2019 have come up. There was about 300 children that were abducted in the United States by a stranger. And so of those 300 children that were abducted, when I'm not trying to minimize the kidnapping aspect of this, but of that 300, they weren't all trafficked. So what we're talking about is a very small number of children that are abducted by a non-family member. And so what we've learned so far this evening is that where the victims mostly come from are where those vulnerabilities are happening. So it's not necessarily from a kidnapping situation. And yet we focus a lot on social media about kidnapping. So just kind of addressing some of the social media posts that have crossed my path in the last year or so. So my favorite one from last year was no child should walk or stand at the bus stop alone for the rest of the school year because human trafficking is an all-time high. And so when I look at that meme from Facebook, and I'm hoping that you're now getting the idea when you see this, is that what we do know is that we know that there's not many stranger abductions. We know that we know about the vulnerabilities that lead to trafficking. So, and we also know that a trafficker really doesn't want to kidnap a child that somebody's going to look for. And so sharing this meme on social media is not really an accurate portrayal about how human trafficking happens. Now, you can ask, is it safe for my child to walk or stand at a bus stop by themselves? I mean, something could happen to them. I don't know where you live, but they could get hit by a car, they could be assaulted, or a number of different things. But the chances of being trafficked in that situation is very minimal. One of the new ones I saw back a few weeks ago, especially when the mask mandate came out for COVID-19, was that wearing masks somehow makes a child more vulnerable in a store and more enticing for a human trafficker to steal from a store. And what we know is that we're looking at the vulnerabilities. We know that children often are not stolen and being trafficked. And so we really want to avoid sharing something like this on social media. And there's been no evidence of that actually happening. Another one that was shared probably in the last couple of years is the shirt on the windshield or maybe zip ties on the cars, and that leads to a person being trafficked. There has been 0 reports in law enforcement throughout the entire country that has led to human trafficking. I will say that if you have that incident happening in a parking lot, it's probably for assault, that more likely than a human trafficking. And then we oftentimes hear stories of people walking around in IKEA or Target or Meijer. In fact, there was something about a week ago, somebody referring to at the Oxford Meijer that they were being followed in the store, and actually connecting that with being trafficked. And again, what we know is that that's not usually how trafficking happens. Not to say that shady things aren't potentially going to happen, but there has not been, and actually in that case where that happened with the Oxford Meijer a couple weeks ago, there wasn't even a report to law enforcement about that incident. So we have to be very careful about what we share. Again, another thing that was in the news not too long ago was the Wayfair scandal, and they talked about this elaborate scheme of children being sold on the Wayfair site. There's actually been 0 credibility to that story. There was some investigations that happened, but again, there was no credibility to that story at all. Another thing that I'm sure you've seen on social media is the hashtag Save the Children or Save Our Children. I will tell you that the first one, the Save the Children, is actually an organization that helps children throughout the world as far as their poverty, as far as safety and security, etc. And what has happened when people started sharing these conspiracy stories and hashtagging Save the Children, it was really hijacking that particular organization's hashtag, and it was minimizing a lot of their efforts. And so I just want to caution you before you, I'm not sure if you're a person that shares these hashtags, but we need to make sure that we're sharing accurate information and that we're not sharing something on the Save the Children hashtag, because that's actually a nonprofit's organization, and we don't want it connected to conspiracy theories. So why don't we want these, what is the harm in sharing these memes or social media posts or these conspiracy theories? What is the harm in that? Especially I hear, well, if it saves just one child, it's worth it. What these conspiracy theories do is it distracts from the real causes of human trafficking. So it distracts from the fact that we need to address poverty, we need to address food insecurity, we need to address foster care, we need to address all these vulnerabilities that lead to trafficking, and these conspiracy theories draw people away and distract them from the real causes. And it actually hurts the anti-human trafficking movement. So I wanted to kind of give you an idea of what you would be looking for if you're looking for signs of human trafficking. And oftentimes, the victims are hidden in plain sight. So if you're not paying attention, that person can slip through the cracks. So I'm going to go over some signs of what you can look for human trafficking. So some of the common work and living conditions, these victims are not free to leave and come and go as they please. Again, if there's a child that's under the age of 18 that's providing commercial sex acts, that's automatically human trafficking. You don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion, and there's no such thing as a child prostitute. If they're in the commercial sex industry and they have a pimp or a manager, they're usually unpaid or paid very little or paid through tips. Work excessively long and unusual hours, not allowed to take breaks or have unusual restrictions, owe a large debt and they're unable to pay it off. So many times if somebody is brought in from another country for labor trafficking, they have accrued a large debt of transportation, the paperwork, the visas, the passports, and that is something that has accrued and they're unable to pay that off. They were recruited through false promises, including a job or education or money to bring them here. Also, any high security measures in their living or work conditions, that like barbed wire, bars on windows, boarded up windows, again, as in that those folks that perished in Novi, the lock on the basement door and they're unable to leave. They tend to have poor mental health or abnormal behavior. And so when we're talking about maybe students in school, or we're talking about somebody that goes to the emergency room, or maybe at a store, they're often fearful and anxious and depressed and submissive. They exhibit this type of behavior, especially around law enforcement. They avoid eye contact, are in poor physical health, lack health care. Oftentimes when they do show up in the emergency room, it's a very serious issue by that time, because they don't just go to the doctor for the flu. They're going for something very significant. May appear malnourished, and then may show some physical or sexual abuse or some physical restraint or torture. They oftentimes don't have control of their personal possessions, their driver's license, their passports. They don't have financial records or bank accounts. They don't have control over any of their IDs. Oftentimes, they're not able to speak for themselves. So a third party may be present for translating and or to speak for that particular person, because the manager or the pimp is worried about the victim, giving away too much information. They oftentimes don't know where they're at. They don't know their address. They don't know where they're staying, what city that they're in. They don't have a sense of time and not often recall things in chronological order. So there's often numerous inconsistencies in their story. So what should you do if you suspect human trafficking? One is that you never approach or handle the situation on your own, and that's for two reasons. One is for your own safety. You never want to put yourself in harm's way in a very dangerous situation. The other is that oftentimes by you approaching a victim, that puts them in more danger. And so we want to be very careful that we don't add to the issue and cause that victim to have some type of physical abuse or whatnot to happen to them after you have addressed that victim. If it's imminent danger, that something is actually happening right then and it looks like this is a very dangerous situation, contacting the local law enforcement or calling 911 is that would be your course of action. However, if it's something that just looks suspicious, that looks weird to you, then you would contact the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And I had referred to that in some prior slides of mine, and I will give you that number in a little in a couple minutes. But to give you an example of what should be called into the National Human Trafficking Hotline, so I just watched a webinar today referencing, they had a guest speaker from Polaris, and with all the Wayfair conspiracy, and there's just been a increased interest in human trafficking, they have gotten a lot of calls at the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So one of the things that somebody would call in and say, I saw a suspicious white van with no windows at the rest stop. Well, there are a lot of white vans without windows that your plumbers and your construction workers actually use. What the difference between that call and saying, gee, I saw this white van at the party store or a rest stop, and 9 people got out of the back of it, and somebody was really watching them as they went to the bathroom and came back. That would be something I would report to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. It's a very specific thing that happened, not just a suspicious white van, but an actual action that's happened as a result of that. Another example would be if you are at a nail salon and you see a mattress in the back room. Let's say they go back there to get a cup of coffee and they come out and you see a mattress and it looks like somebody's living in the back room. That would also be something that you would contact the National Human Trafficking Hotline, because that's somebody that's potentially living in those in that particular nail salon, because that's where they live and that's where they're being potentially trafficked out of that. So And what the National Human Trafficking Hotline will do is that if they find the tip as credible, they will contact local law enforcement at that particular time. So that kind of gives you an idea of how you handle that situation. So the question would be, what can you do? So again, the first part of my presentation is I'm hoping whatever drew you here, whether it was fear or curiosity or whatever, that you turn that into some type of action and that you take away what you've learned and you do something with that information. So you can actually put human trafficking into 4 different categories, and this is kind of my thing, not necessarily something that somebody's done. But human trafficking falls into education, prevention, ending the demand, and victim services. And again, I like visuals and I like stories, and so that you can take this away with you. So if you've ever heard of the story of the river, it was a story that was told about a village that people were working alongside a river. And what they noticed as they were working alongside the river is they saw a baby floating down the river in a basket. And so they rescued that baby out of the river. This is just an illustration of a story. And as in the course of a few days, they noticed more babies coming down the river, and they got more people to help, and they were rescuing these babies out of the river, and they were spending all their time rescuing these babies out of the river. After a couple weeks, the villagers were exhausted because they were trying to rescue all these babies, and somebody had said, why don't we find out what's going on up the river that all these babies are coming down? And one of the villagers said, no, we need all hands on deck because we need to save these babies. And why I'm telling you this illustration is because many times when we talk about trafficking, we focus just on the victim services, which I think is a wonderful thing to focus on. But there are so many other areas in trafficking where we can get involved, and many of those are before the babies are in the river. So this is my illustration, and I hope this helps you, is that when we talk about manipulating those vulnerabilities equaling human trafficking, when we talk about poverty and trauma and sexual and physical abuse, food insecurity, foster care, homelessness, the LGBT community, those are all those vulnerabilities. Those are the babies in the basket up the river. And so, and the ones that are being rescued are the victim services. So what I want you to, when you're thinking about how you can get involved, many of us will go right to the victim services, but many of our skill wheels aren't in victim services. They're more in the education, prevention, and ending the demand. So we're going to talk about a little bit about how you can go about helping. And Polaris actually stated this very well when they were talking about trafficking, is that we cannot end human trafficking one person and one survivor at a time. We need to target the systems that make the trafficking possible. So those are those systems that are throwing the babies into the river to begin with and are leading to them, the victims, having to be rescued. So our goal is to attack those vulnerabilities so that we don't have as many victims to save. But what does that mean for us? And there's 2 things, is that when we're considering how to get involved, is that we want to stay in our own lane. And so we stay into where our skill wheel is. And so for me, with my background, I probably wouldn't jump to helping rescue victims out of trafficking. I don't have a law enforcement background, so I wouldn't jump to that, as well as I wouldn't counsel victims of human trafficking because I don't have the schooling or the background to be able to do that. So staying in your own lane means that you are staying with your skill set. It's so that you're not victimizing the victim again by doing something incorrectly. And then also not recreating the wheel. And we tend to get very excited about maybe starting our own thing and starting our own program or starting our own nonprofit. And a lot of times what happens is that we're almost better off working alongside of another organization and helping their efforts, especially one that's doing the whatever it is very well. And so just caution that whatever we're doing, that we're not recreating the wheel and duplicating efforts, that we are really trying to collaborate with other organizations. So ways to get involved, again, is reporting suspicious activity to the human trafficking hotline. See something, say something. Educate your circle of influence and pass along accurate information. So knowing the facts and the myths and what to share and what not to share. So when you're seeing social media posts or you're reading an article before you share it, if it's got a lot of data in it, potentially might not be true. If it's sensationalizing trafficking, it's probably not true. So now that you know the facts and the myths, scrutinize the articles more often. Fundraise for organizations that address the vulnerabilities. Look into the supply chain of the products you purchase, and I'll address that a little bit in a couple more slides because I didn't address that very much. Volunteer at an anti-trafficking or victim services organization. Some examples would be Sanctum House, Alternative for Girls, Grace Centers of Hope, Salvation Army, and Hope Against Trafficking. Actually, the Michigan Abolitionist Project collaborates a lot with Salvation Army and Hope Against Trafficking and Sanctum House. And so those are organizations that are already doing great things in this area. And they are always looking for volunteers to work with them, either transporting survivors to doctor's appointments, etc., fundraising. There's numerous types of things you can do for that organization. Volunteer or assist at-risk populations. So children in foster care, tutoring programs, food assistance programs, those are all preventative measures and how you prevent people from getting trafficked or getting a part of that life. Support organizations that want to build safe houses, foster care facilities, and rehabilitation facilities in your area. And this is something that's near and dear to my heart because I feel that some communities reject having organizations come in, whether it's a safe house, whether it's a group home for foster care children, because they're afraid of how that will affect their home values. But if you look at the flip side of it is you really want to have these organizations in nice neighborhoods so that when they walk out the door, they're not back into the same place we took them out of. And so we want to make sure that we can build these safe houses in nice areas with a lot of support services. And then educating our children and youth about respecting boundaries, about what objectification is and what healthy relationships look like. And that's addressing the demand for trafficking and sexual exploitation. So I get this question a lot as how I'm personally involved in the anti-human trafficking movement other than doing these presentations. And I hesitate to share this because I want your experience and what you want to do to be where you're comfortable with and where your skill wheel is. However, I did get called out in an evaluation one time, and they wanted to know what I actually do. So I figured I would go through what I've been doing the last 5 years and attacking this topic. So the first thing I did was I educated myself on the topic of human trafficking, similar to what you're doing here tonight. And then I joined an anti-trafficking organization, which was the Michigan Abolitionist Project. Over the course of several years, I have attended trainings from the Michigan Human Trafficking Task Force. I've gone to conferences. I read a tremendous amount on this topic. So I'm always updating my information and educating myself on this particular topic. I've chosen to educate my community about human trafficking through these awareness presentations and speaking to people in the community. I also chair an organization in my area for at-risk youth, which helps do scholarships for skill building, summer camps, and educational programs. I started a food program for children in my community that addresses food insecurity. And then I also coordinate a tutoring program at a local elementary school, and I targeted the elementary school that had the highest rate of free and reduced lunch. Which would assess some of the needs, a need in my community. So, and if you notice, the 3 out of the 5 of the things that I do don't have a aren't directly like they are human trafficking, but they address at-risk youth and at-risk youth. They address some of the vulnerabilities that lead to trafficking, meaning that they address food insecurity and poverty, and also addressing some educational needs that these students might have. So when you look at how you get involved in the anti-trafficking movement, it may not be directly in the human trafficking space, but it could be directly involved in addressing the vulnerabilities. So usually at this point, I get people looking at me like, I am so overwhelmed and I have no idea what I'm going to do with this information. And you are not alone, because I've had that feeling many times when I learn about this topic. But there's a couple quotes that really have helped me over the past couple years in trying to center me in figuring out what I would like to do. One of my favorites is from Mother Teresa, and she says, don't worry about the numbers. Help one person at a time and always start with the person nearest to you. So none of the things that you get involved in have to be grandiose plans. They can be mentoring somebody in your neighborhood or befriending a child in your neighborhood. It could be working at your local food bank or donating food to your local food bank. Just do something that's maybe just a small gesture, and small gestures add up over time. So make sure that you're not getting too overwhelmed and that you get stuck and you don't do anything. Another one of my favorites is by Maya Angelou, and it's do the best that you can until you know better, and then when you know better, you do better. And I think this is helpful in this topic, as well as anything that you want to get involved in, is that sometimes you feel really guilty about, boy, I just didn't know that this happened, and now I feel guilty about it. But now that you know, then do something differently. And so I think this is a very important concept for not only trafficking, but for anything that we do. So again, my organization does multiple presentations. This one is Human Trafficking 101, but I also have a presentation about how many slaves work for you that actually addresses labor trafficking, and I'll have a couple slides on that to kind of tease you into wanting to hear that particular presentation. I also do a presentation on demand and pornography, and believe it or not, there is a link between trafficking and pornography and the viewing of pornography. And then for those of you that have book clubs, my group that I'm in, Lake Orion Oxford Community Group, we can lead your book club discussion. We have a list of books that we would recommend. And this is a great opportunity to share this with your circle of influence and have us lead your book club discussion and also share information on trafficking. And again, I've done presentations 30 minutes to an hour and a half, and I've done them from high school and to people that are well into their 80s. So it can be modified by content and by audience. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of taste of labor trafficking. And as I mentioned earlier on in my presentation, we talked about there being more victims of labor trafficking than sex trafficking. So this is a huge issue, not only in our country, but throughout the entire world. And many people look at the fact that, well, things are manufactured here, and my cousin works at that plant, and there's nothing going on there. But what we have to think about is the supply chain and where the products come from. So oftentimes, maybe they're manufactured here in the United States, but then the materials, the raw materials that come into that factory might have slavery in their supply chain. So it's it goes pretty deep into the process, that it's not necessarily always the manufacturer. It could be where we got the raw materials. So just to further ruin your evening, there's four different things, and I think there's a huge number more. But these are probably the four most common that most people that listen to my presentation would relate to. So mica is the first one. So mica is a sparkly mineral that is mined. About 90% of it is mined out of India by small children. And you're probably saying to me, well, I don't use mica. I don't have any idea what it is. Well, if you have sparkles in your makeup, whether it's your eyeshadow, your lipstick, your lotion, that's mica. And so there's slavery in the supply chain of that particular product. Another example, because usually I'll have one or two men in my audience and they'll say, ha, I don't wear makeup, so this doesn't apply to me. Well, if you have sparkles in your paint on your car, also mica. And that's usually harvested by 90% of it is by children in India. Again, chocolate is another area that we have slavery in the supply chain. Chocolate, cocoa beans tend to be harvested by children. That's exactly how it's done, with a large machete. So the kids are climbing up into the trees and cutting those cocoa beans down. Most of your most common chocolate manufacturers have slavery in their supply chain. Coffee is another area, that it's children and usually children and women that are trafficked, and they harvest the coffee beans, as well as clothing, whether it's the manufacturing process of sewing and putting together the clothing, or actually where the raw materials come from. Like, for example, cotton is a raw material that is often use labor trafficking in order to harvest the cotton. And so this is kind of give you some of the companies that use slaves in their supply chain. And I can tell you that probably most of the things that you use on a daily basis have slavery in their supply chain. So it's a very common thing to do. So if you notice, a lot of your chocolate manufacturers, I was devastated when I saw that M&M's was on there, because it's my favorite candy. I also wanted to point out, because many people will say, oh, I see Walmart on there and Forever 21, and those are cheap stores that sell cheap clothing, so I'm not going to shop there because that obviously has labor in their supply chain. Well, I can also tell you that your manufacturers of more expensive items also have slavery in their supply chain. Like, for example, Victoria's Secret. The Victoria's Secret bras are way more expensive than the Walmart bras, but they have slavery in their supply chain. If you look at leather goods, expensive purses from high-end manufacturers, leather is another area that there's slavery in the supply chain. So leather shoes, gold, silver, diamonds, jewelry, phones, technology, and the list goes on, and there's slavery in that supply chain. So it's very important. Hopefully they invite me back here and I can go over that into more detail, but this is just the tip of the iceberg of companies that use slavery in their supply chain. So I'm going to leave this slide up for a minute. This is the National Human Trafficking Hotline. I would encourage people that if they have their phones handy, that they put this into their phone. And again, to review, you would call this if it's a non-emergency situation. If you see something weird and you think it may be a sign of somebody being trafficked, this is the number that you would call. So hopefully you'll take the opportunity to put that in your phone at this particular time. And you can also look that up on the web, just putting the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and that number will come up. So this is the time that I would like to address any questions that people may have on any of my slides or something that I have not covered at this time. So does anybody have any questions? And I am going to stop sharing my presentation at this point in time.
Hi, Dawn. I have been keeping eyes here on the chat. I will start off. I got one kind of question with a little bit of context from Jennifer.
Okay.
She explains she was a volunteer for Big Brother and Big Sister for years. She worked with one girl for years, also did an internship where she worked with a group of children. Finding a big brother or big sister for a child was her biggest goal in the program. So she asked, and I think you might be able to elaborate a little more on how so, but she asked, would work like that for an organization like that be helpful in, as you mentioned, preventing trafficking risk and helping children at risk? Because through that she was helping children at risk.
Yes, and actually that's exactly what we were talking about, is addressing those vulnerabilities that lead to trafficking. So Big Brothers Big Sisters is a Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, any organization that that pours love, affection, attention into children are the ones that are going to prevent trafficking from happening, because there is that connection with another human. And that is exactly what I'm talking about when we talk about getting involved in organizations that prevent trafficking. So thank you for doing that, and I encourage others to make that investment and being a mentor to a child. And again, it might just be one child, but you have no idea what the ripple effect would be in that case. So thank you for doing that.
Oh, that's great. And I got a question actually before the program, which you certainly addressed during your program, from Christine. Excuse me, from Christine, and she asks, she wanted to know what you can do to help combat, as a citizen, what can you do to help combat human trafficking? And I think how we can more maybe specifically ask that is, you know, you're sitting with somebody who's like, they're like, you know, oh, I don't know what I could do. What would you say would be your go-to recommendation for somebody who's like, oh, I heard about all this bad stuff. What should I start with? Like, how should I get started?
Okay, so the first thing is two things I would do if you're gonna, if you say I want to start tonight or tomorrow. The first thing that I would do is that making sure that what you're sharing on your social media is correct. And so not sharing an article or a meme or whatever on social media that perpetuates those myths or the conspiracy theories. The other thing is that I would highly recommend that you show your circle of influence that stopped this traffic video that was on YouTube that we saw. And hopefully when you view it at home, it won't be as choppy as it was on Zoom. But that is a really good starting point for people to open up the discussion about what that looks like here in the state of Michigan, and then also talk about the vulnerabilities that lead to trafficking. So those would be the top two of what you can do in the first week. And then I then would start thinking about, what is your passion? I mean, do you like to mentor children? Are you good at fundraising? Because there's so many organizations that need money, that do great work, that need people that are on their side to help fundraise for them. Maybe you have free time and you would like to be trained in order to drive one of the survivors to doctor's appointments, etc. That could be another avenue that you could get involved in. One of the organizations that if people like to work with children, there's an organization that's out of Oxford and also Holly called House of Providence, and they are a rehabilitation home for foster children. They are always looking for mentors and people to work for their organization, and they are a fabulous organization that rehabilitates children. So again, foster children are a huge feeder pool for traffickers. So 70% is estimated of your trafficking victims come from the foster care system. So anything that happens in foster care is an area that you can get involved in. So hopefully that answered that question.
Great, thank you very much. And I'll go ahead and just say, if anybody else has a question, take a moment to think of one. I'm going to ask one myself while people have a moment to ask a question. If we don't get anything afterwards, I think we can probably call that a night.
All right, thanks.
But a question I had is, at the end, you know, obviously I think you'll probably explore this a little more in like the labor presentation, but just as a general topic, you kind of address like, oh, here's an example of all these companies, and you know, there's so many companies involved in somewhere along the supply chain using or exploiting slavery, and with so many different companies, because I think a lot of people's instinctual reaction is, well, I'm going to boycott this company and boycott this company, and there's so many of them. What do you think you would say to somebody who's getting that feeling of, I just don't feel right buying from these companies, but they don't know where to turn? Like, what should I do going forward?
Okay, so I can tell you that there are very few products honestly, that don't have slavery in their supply chain. And so, as funny as this may sound, you will be sitting in the room naked because most of your clothing has slavery in the supply chain. You will not be able to use your phone. You will not be looking on your computer. So boycotting products isn't necessarily the most effective thing, because it's just so common that that slavery is in supply chain. In the presentation that I do about labor trafficking, I do have websites that you can go to, as well as have materials of how you can try to research companies that are doing good work as far as limiting the amount of slavery in their supply chain. So there's actually a rating system in which companies are measured against. So are they doing inspections of their manufacturing plants overseas? Are they, how much contact do they have with those manufacturers, and how often do they actually visit them and inspect? So there's a rating system. So obviously what you'd want to do is find a company that has a higher rating that are addressing some of these issues. There's also fair trade items. So if you see fair trade coffee or fair trade chocolate, those companies have made a large investment into making sure that they do not have slavery or have minimal slavery in their supply chain. So I a lot of times will refer to people to Aldi, because they have a line of chocolate that is slavery free. There's also in Lake Orion, to give her a plug, there's a bakery, Nuts About Chocolate, and all their chocolate is fair trade chocolate. And so I always put a shout out to her organization, because they make an effort to only use fair trade chocolate. So boycotting products, probably not the best. It's kind of a balance there, because if everybody stops drinking coffee, guess what happens? All those people in that country that harvest coffee, you take away their job. And they take away the money that they are making. And so it's not always the best idea to boycott an entire product, but just find ones that are doing better at monitoring where they're getting their raw materials, if that makes sense.
I think that makes sense.
Okay.
We also have one more from Jennifer, who asks, because you mentioned a lot of the people come through the foster care system. A lot of children come through the foster care system that end up becoming targets for trafficking of all kinds. And she asks two questions related. It's what kind of information, background checks, counseling do they do with foster parents before they let them become foster parents? And basically further asking, do they conduct investigative visits to foster parents' homes beforehand if this is such a large pool? Like, what kind of steps do they take to prevent these things? And what do you think we could do to assist these processes and help combat this being an avenue that they target?
So to answer your question, there are training programs that foster care parents have to go through. The children are assigned caseworkers and support people. But what we have to think about is, one, we don't filter a lot of money in our foster care system, and so we have lack of funding for making sure that we have enough caseworkers in order to keep tabs on all the kids that they need to keep tabs on. So many of your caseworkers are very overworked, and funneling more additional funds for that is important to do that. The other thing that we also have to think about is the fact that when children enter foster care, these are children that have had traumatic experiences. And so they have a lot of mental health issues as a result of these traumatic experiences. So while we can say that there's really good foster parents and there's probably not so great foster parents, so that is probably a true statement, and they do get training in order to become a foster parent, but you are also working with a population that has a large amount of trauma. And so, and then oftentimes They are either, some of them are ready to be adopted, but there's also ones that are trying to run away to get back to their birth parent or back to a familiar situation. So it's a huge problem. And I think funneling additional funds would be helpful. The other thing, pre-COVID, and this actually happened, COVID happened about 2 weeks before I was supposed to be scheduled to do a presentation at an agency that does training for foster parents, because I think foster parents need to realize that these children are at risk of being trafficked for a variety of reasons. So I see progress coming up in training your foster parents and making sure that they understand that these kids are being lured and they're at high risk. So.
And they even ask, like, do they also continue to monitor or check in on these kinds of things for the parents that continue to be like foster parents that take in kids and then become parents as they continue. And I think also when you're going through, you kind of illuminated, I think we think of it as, how do we make sure that the foster parents are okay, like that they're not doing anything shady, and that's kind of how we tend to think of it.
Yeah.
But I think you're illuminating here that a lot of it is they need to be aware that regardless of the fact that they have foster parents now, they're still at risk because of previous factors that follow them.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's, so it's not as of, there is a nature of the beast, right? I mean, you don't get into foster care because they're just given away. There's some traumatic event, whether it's abuse, neglect, or whatever, that has led them there. So they have their own issues to be able to work through, which lead to the vulnerabilities of being trafficked. The other thing is that I feel the caseworkers are overburdened, and there's just not enough opportunity to be able to check in with those kids. But to address something for Jennifer, because she's the one that wanted to work with Big Brother and Big Sister, or had done that in the past. One of the programs that is through the courts is called CASA, CASA, and they are actually mentors for foster kids. So if you're really looking to mentor foster children, the CASA program is a wonderful way to get involved if you're able to make that investment. One thing I would caution you is that when you're working with vulnerable groups, whether you're working with foster care or you're working with victims of human trafficking, make sure that when you're doing that you're going to make the commitment to be around, and that it's not a one and done type of situation, because the level of trust of letting somebody into their world is at a huge cost to them. And you want to make sure that you show up and that you're willing to continue to show up, because it just shows them, when you stop coming, it shows them that they weren't worth it. And so I always say that when you're going to work with kids, you make a commitment that you're going to work with those kids and that you're going to stick it out for a certain amount of time.
I think that's very good advice. And I think we'll take one more question again from Jennifer. So I think you've really gotten her interested and passionate about this topic. But she asks, what kind of role can schools play in stopping human trafficking? And I think we can even add to that, what can we in the community do to help our schools with, assisting in topics like this?
Okay, so that's a great question, because actually one of my, the ladies that is in my group with me, Linda, that was one of her passions. And we have learned over the course of the years that trying to get into the school district is very difficult, because their curriculum is laid out so tight of what they're able to cover. The good news is that MAP, alongside of Michigan Abolition Project, alongside of, and I think it's Hope Against Trafficking, are coming up with curriculum to be able to pilot in a school district, I believe, around Ann Arbor. And it would be piloted in their health class. And a lot of times the trafficking education falls into the health class area, but there is not a state mandate to talk about human trafficking in the schools. Excuse me. The interesting thing is that when we're talking about trafficking, people, and when you're talking about sexual exploitation, people get a little weirded out about talking about kids about that topic. And we tend to want to introduce that topic in the high school years, but really, we really need to be introducing that in the middle school, because that is actually when this is all starting. And so by high school, it's potentially too late. And so there's ways that we can teach this information at a younger age and make it very effective. And so by the time they get into high school, they have this this knowledge base. The other thing interesting to note is that trafficking education is mandated for healthcare professionals, dental professionals, but it's not mandated for teachers. And so they do not have to get their CEUs. They don't have to have anything that has to do with trafficking. And that's something that needs to change. I think that all teachers should have to have some type of trafficking education and annually, just like the medical professionals, because they actually have the population right in front of them. So being able to recognize those signs. So that's a great question, Jennifer. Something that we need to work on.
I agree, and I'll give a quick thank you to Jennifer for all those questions. As very informative. A big brother, big sister with at least one young lady for 15 years. So thank you very much, Jennifer. It sounds like you've done a lot of great work, and I hope this is very inspirational to you. I hope you carry this forward. And I would like to go ahead and thank you, Dawn, for helping us out tonight and giving this fantastic presentation. I know I found it really informative. I'll just pass along to you to just say if there's anything you wanted to say as a final statement or anything along those lines, and then we can go ahead and wrap it out.
Again, I just appreciate the opportunity to talk about this, and I appreciate that all of you stuck with it through this entire presentation. It's a very difficult topic to address, and I just when I was talking with Joe earlier, I had said that many times what happens is that people have this the curiosity and they really want to learn about this, but then when it gets to the date of the presentation, they hesitate to attend. And it's because I think this topic is very overwhelming. So I would hope that I give a round of applause to all of you for attending tonight, because it's very important that we are passing along accurate information and that we're fighting this, fighting human trafficking, because we cannot solve this problem alone. It means every one of us getting involved in some way and using our talents to do that. So thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
You're welcome, and thank you very much for giving this fantastic presentation, Dawn. I will say on behalf of the library, we want to once again thank you for giving this presentation, and we hope all of you who came here, we thank you for coming out to watch the presentation or logging on to watch the presentation, and we hope you'll come back and join us for any more presentations. We have another one coming up, as mentioned before, on Tuesday, and we should have this edited and uploaded to our YouTube channel next week. If you want to share this great information with anybody you know, seems like a very good introductory program for a lot of people. So thank you all for joining us. We hope you will join us again, and we hope you all have a great evening.
All right, thank you.